The moment Roy Wallace rode into Dusty Creek, New Mexico territory, in the spring of 1882, every single soul in town dropped what they were doing and stared. Every soul, that is, except for Belle Langston, who was far too busy arguing with a stubborn mule to notice that the most notorious bounty hunter west of the Pecos had just tied his horse at the hitching post outside her feed store. The mule, a gray-eared creature she had named Aristotle on account of his irritating habit of refusing to move unless he personally agreed with the direction, had planted all four hooves into the dirt of the loading dock, and was regarding Belle with the kind of patient contempt that only mules can truly manage. Belle had her hands braced on his neck, her boots dug in, her dark hair coming loose from its pins in the warm April wind, and she was explaining to him in a low, firm voice that the hay needed to go into the back barn and not the front barn, and that if he did not cooperate, she was going to seriously consider selling him to the glue factory in Santa Fe. "Miss Langston," said old Pete Dawson from the front porch of the hardware store across the street, his voice carrying the particular hushed reverence of a man who had just witnessed something that both thrilled and frightened him. "Miss Langston, you might want to come have a look at who just rode in." "In a minute, Pete," Belle said, not looking up. "It is Roy Wallace," Pete said. Across the street, half a dozen men straightened in their chairs. Two women pulled their shawls tighter. The barkeep at the Silver Spur Saloon pressed himself just slightly back from his window. The name Roy Wallace did something to the air of Dusty Creek. It tightened it, made it go thin and electric, like the sky before a lightning storm. Belle gave Aristotle one final firm push, and the mule, apparently deciding that this battle was not worth the effort, grudgingly moved toward the back barn. Belle wiped her hands on her apron and finally looked up, shielding her eyes with one hand against the afternoon sun. She saw a man tying his horse. He was tall, very tall, with broad shoulders, filling out a dark brown trail coat that had seen considerable use. He wore a gray hat with a low crown, and his movements were unhurried and deliberate in the way that only truly confident people ever manage. He had dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, a jaw shadowed with 2 or 3 days of travel, and eyes, even from across the street. Belle could see they were a remarkable shade of gray-green, like sage after rain. He did not look particularly remarkable to her, beyond being handsome in the weathered way that men who spent long days on horseback sometimes were. "Who?" Belle asked. Pete Dawson's mouth fell open. He stared at her, then he looked at the man, then back at her. "Roy Wallace," he repeated more slowly, as though perhaps she had misheard him the first time. "Does he have an account with us?" Belle asked because the feed store ledger was the primary thing on her mind. Pete made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a cough. "No, ma'am. No, I don't believe he does." Belle nodded and went back inside to finish tallying the morning's inventory, and Roy Wallace, for his part, had not yet looked in her direction at all. He was busy assessing the town the way a man who had learned to always assess his surroundings did, methodically, quietly, letting his eyes move over the rooftops and the alley openings and the general arrangement of things. He had ridden a long way. He was tired in his bones, the kind of tired that a night in a real bed and a meal that did not come from a saddle bag would go a considerable distance toward fixing. He had no particular attachment to Dusty Creek, except that it was the last known location of a man named Cutter Briggs, who had robbed a stage near Silver City 8 weeks ago and made off with a Wells Fargo strongbox containing $6,000. Wells Fargo was paying $300 for his return, which was a considerable sum, and one that Roy Wallace had decided was worth his time. He was 31 years old, and he had been doing this work since he was 22, and he had gotten very good at it, though he had not particularly planned to. He had also gotten, over the years, rather famous for it, a fact he accepted with the same reserved neutrality that he accepted most things. The fame was useful sometimes and inconvenient other times, and he had learned to live with both. He walked into the Silver Spur because a saloon was always the best place to start gathering information in a town, and because he wanted a whiskey and a meal, in that order. The barkeep set a glass in front of him before he even asked, which told Roy that the man had recognized him. The two cowboys at the far end of the bar found reasons to pay their tabs and leave, which also told him something. Roy drank his whiskey and ordered a plate of beans and cornbread, and asked in a quiet, conversational voice whether a man answering to the name of Cutter Briggs, 40 years old, red beard, missing the top of his left ear, had passed through recently. The barkeep, whose name was Dale Hutchins and who was a sensible man with a wife and 3 children to think about, said that a fellow matching that description had indeed come through 4 days ago, had drunk considerable amounts of whiskey, had won $12 at cards, and had ridden out heading east toward the Ruidoso River Valley. Roy thanked him, ate his beans, and decided he would rest his horse overnight before continuing east in the morning. He rented a room at Mrs. Gallagher's boarding house, which was the only boarding house Dusty Creek had, and after depositing his saddlebags and his rifle and washing the trail dust from his face in the basin on the washstand, he walked back out into the early evening to get the feel of the town. It was a decent-sized settlement for this part of New Mexico territory, perhaps 200 people, Roy estimated, with a proper main street and a church and a school and a physician's office and various commercial establishments. There was money moving through here, agricultural money mostly. He could see it in the quality of some of the storefronts. The feed store was one of these, solidly built, well-painted, the sign above the door reading Langston Feed and Supply in clean black letters. The sign caught his eye only because he could see through the open front window that the lamps were still burning inside, which struck him as late for a business to be open. As he passed, he happened to glance in. The woman was at the counter, bent over a large ledger book, writing figures with the focused concentration of someone who took their accounts seriously. She had changed from whatever she had been wearing earlier. He had not noticed her then, his attention having been elsewhere, and was now in a blue dress that suited her dark hair. There was a small frown of concentration between her brows, and she was mouthing numbers silently as she worked. He did not stop walking, but he found himself aware of the lit window for another half block, the way you sometimes notice a warmth behind you after you have already moved away from a fire. The following morning, Roy came down to breakfast at Mrs. Gallagher's to find himself seated across from the town physician, a pleasant, round-faced man named Dr. Edgar Prout, who was delighted to have a famous breakfast companion, and who talked with great enthusiasm while Roy ate his eggs in companionable silence. Dr. Prout told him several things about Dusty Creek in the course of 20 minutes. That the town had been founded in 1871, that the primary economy was cattle and farming, that the mayor was a man named Charles Fitch who had come out from Ohio and had not entirely gotten over it, that there had been some trouble with water rights on the western ranches last summer, and that the feed store was run by a young woman named Belle Langston, 24 years old, who had taken over the business after her father's death 2 years ago and had, through what Dr. Prout described as pure stubborn determination and considerable business sense, made it more profitable than it had ever been under her father's management. Roy listened to this, ate a piece of toast, and said nothing. He should have left that morning. The trail east was clear. He had the information he needed, and every day he waited was a day more distance between him and Cutter Briggs. But his horse, Thunder, had thrown a shoe the previous evening, and the blacksmith could not get to him until mid-morning, and so Roy found himself with 2 unplanned hours on his hands in a town that knew exactly who he was. He decided to walk to the far end of Main Street and back, which was something to do, and also something he had learned to do in unfamiliar places. It was useful to understand the full physical layout of a town, the exits and the narrow places, the positions of things. He was halfway back when the door of the feed store opened with some force and Belle Langston came out carrying a crate that was clearly too heavy for one person, though she appeared to be disputing this fact with considerable confidence. The crate contained sacks of something that clunked heavily salt, he guessed, or perhaps mineral supplements for cattle, and it was large enough that she could not entirely see over it, which was why she did not see the uneven plank on the boardwalk that had been left sticking up about an inch higher than its neighbors. Her boot caught it. Roy moved without thinking. He was across the distance in 3 long strides and had the crate before it hit the ground, taking it from her hands in one smooth motion. And Belle, who had grabbed the hitching post with one hand and caught herself from falling, but had not quite managed to save the crate, found herself upright and unhurt and looking up at a stranger who was now holding her delivery of salt blocks as though they weighed nothing in particular. "Thank you," she said, slightly breathless, more from the quick surprise than from any real exertion. She looked at him with frank, direct brown eyes. "That board has been a menace for 2 weeks. I have asked Chester Willis to fix it 3 times. "Where do you want these?" Roy asked, because the crate was still in his hands and it seemed the natural question. "In the back, if you do not mind. Through the store and out the rear door. I will show you." He followed her through the store, which was organized with the clean efficiency of someone who thought carefully about the arrangement of things, and out through the back into a storage area where various feed supplies were stacked in orderly rows. "Right there," she said, indicating a wooden shelf, and he set the crate down without visible effort. She was looking at him with the same frank curiosity that she might have directed at a piece of equipment she had not seen before, assessing and interested, but without the particular charged quality that most people's attention took on when they looked at Roy Wallace. There was no recognition in her expression, none at all. It was so unusual that he almost said something, almost told her. "Are you new to town?" she asked instead, which confirmed it entirely. She had no idea. "Just passing through," he said. "Well, passing through or not, you have my thanks. I am Belle Langston." She offered her hand with the directness of a woman who had been conducting business long enough that the gesture had become natural, and he shook it. "Roy Wallace," he said. She nodded pleasantly. "Are you looking to buy anything while you are in town, Mr. Wallace? Grain, hay? We have a good supply of oats right now." "My horse could use a good bag of oats," he said, and he did not entirely plan to say it. She smiled then, and it was a good smile, quick and genuine, the kind that reached all the way into her eyes, and she moved toward the front of the store to get his order, and Roy Wallace stood in the storage room of a feed store in Dusty Creek, New Mexico territory, and felt something move in him that he had not felt move in a very long time. He bought the oats and left. He told himself that was the end of it. Thunder's shoe was repaired by midday. Roy loaded his saddlebags, settled his hat, and stood at the hitching post in front of Mrs. Gallagher's boarding house with every intention of mounting up and heading east. He stood there for 3 minutes. Then he went back inside and told Mrs. Gallagher he would need the room for another night, and gave her a reason about wanting to be sure Thunder had eaten and rested adequately after the shoeing, which was not entirely untrue and not entirely the whole truth either. He spent the afternoon doing what he had told himself. He was allowing Thunder to rest and graze at the town's small livery stable, where a cheerful young man named Tommy Rays kept meticulous care of the horses and talked enthusiastically about the race. He planned to enter his sorrel mare in at the county fair in Lincoln that summer. Roy listened to him, fed Thunder handfuls of the excellent oats, and thought about brown eyes and a direct handshake. At supper that evening, the dining room at Mrs. Gallagher's was fuller than it had been at breakfast, 6 boarders and 2 invited guests, which was apparently a Friday tradition at the boarding house, a proper sit-down supper with Mrs. Gallagher's excellent roast chicken and apple pie after. Roy sat at the long table and passed the bread and spoke when spoken to, and was in the act of reaching for the salt when the door opened and Mrs. Gallagher said, "Belle, dear, there you are. I was afraid the accounts had kept you." Belle Langston came in, still slightly flushed from what Roy guessed had been a brisk walk, wearing a dark red dress and carrying a small covered dish, some kind of dessert contribution. It turned out to be a dried apple cake, and she moved to the table and sat down and looked across at him with that expression of simple, friendly recognition that was, by now, almost physically startling to him in its ordinariness. "Mr. Wallace," she said, "are you still in town? I thought you said you were passing through." "I decided to let my horse rest an extra day," he said. She accepted this without suspicion, which was of course exactly what an innocent person who had never heard of Roy Wallace and had no reason to suspect his stated reasons would do, and the strangeness of it settled over him again like something warm and slightly disorienting. She sat 2 seats down from him at the table, and through the course of the meal he found himself aware of her in the way that he was aware of things that mattered, with the particular quiet attention he gave to things he was trying to understand. She laughed readily. She had strong opinions about the territorial governor's handling of the water rights dispute, which she expressed with the precise and well-reasoned passion of someone who had spent time thinking about it rather than just feeling about it. She asked Dr. Prout a series of sharp questions about a new strain of blight affecting wheat crops that he clearly could not fully answer, and she did not pretend to accept his partial answers as complete ones. She was, Roy thought, eating his chicken and trying not to think about her too directly, a very interesting person. After supper, the boarders drifted to the small sitting room, and Mrs. Gallagher served coffee, and the evening took on the comfortable, unhurried quality of a Friday in a small town where people had nowhere particular to be. Someone produced a fiddle and played a few tunes, not expertly but pleasantly, and the conversation broke into smaller clusters. Roy found himself in the corner with a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cool, watching Belle Langston explain something to Mrs. Gallagher with animated hands, and he became aware that Pete Dawson, who had also apparently been invited to Friday's supper, was standing at his elbow. "She still does not know," Pete murmured, with a tone of combined astonishment and amusement that he was trying to keep quiet. "No," Roy said. "In 2 years of running that store she has read more newspapers than anyone in this county," Pete said. "She could tell you the names of every territorial legislator and probably their horses, but she has never read anything about you." "She is busy with her business," Roy said. "She is," Pete agreed. "And I suppose you do not see your name in the agricultural reports or the feed price columns." He paused. "Are you planning to tell her?" Roy was quiet for a moment. Across the room, Belle had stopped explaining things to Mrs. Gallagher and had picked up the fiddle that its owner had set down, and was apparently tuning it with an air of competence that suggested she actually knew how to play. "She plays," Roy said. "Learned from her father," Pete confirmed. "She plays beautifully." Belle drew the bow across the strings and began to play, and the room went pleasantly quiet around her. She played a reel first, fast and bright, and then something slower and sweeter that Roy did not know the name of, but that settled in his chest like something he had not known he was missing. He thought about Pete's question. He did not have a good answer for it. He told himself that it did not matter whether he told her or not, because he would be leaving tomorrow and it would make no difference either way. He left the next morning. He rode east. He found the trail of Cutter Briggs and followed it for 2 days into the Ruidoso River Valley, and on the second afternoon he found Briggs camped at a creek bend, half drunk and thoroughly careless, and the business of it was done with less drama than these things sometimes involved: a brief conversation, a set of irons, and a 4-day ride back to Silver City to collect the $300 reward. It was fine work. Clean, straightforward, as he liked it. He collected the money in Silver City and sat in the Wells Fargo office counting it, and he thought about Dusty Creek, which was approximately 40 miles northwest of where he was sitting. He had other work. There was a man in Arizona Territory who had skipped a court appearance and whose bondsman was anxious. There was a cattle thief in Colorado who had been causing significant trouble for ranchers in the San Luis Valley. Both of these things were his professional responsibility, and both of them were in directions that were not northwest. He rode northwest. He arrived in Dusty Creek on a Wednesday, 12 days after he had left. It was morning, and the main street was busy with the commerce of midweek. And when he tied Thunder at the hitching post outside the feed store, the sensation was less like returning to a familiar place, and more like walking back into something he had been turning over in his mind and needed to see clearly. He went in. Belle was behind the counter, writing in her ledger, and she looked up when the door opened, and her expression moved through several things in quick succession: surprise, then a pleased warmth, then something more controlled and practical. "Mr. Wallace, back so soon?" "I had some business near Silver City," he said. "I was passing through." The corner of her mouth moved. "You say that a great deal for someone who seems to keep arriving." "I suppose I do," he said. She looked at him for a moment with those direct brown eyes, and then she said, "I have a delivery coming this afternoon that will require moving some significant weight around the back store. Tommy Ray's usually helps, but he is occupied with the fair preparations. Would you be willing to earn your oats, so to speak?" "Yes," he said. So he spent the morning in Dusty Creek earning his oats, as Belle had put it, helping unload a freight wagon carrying what turned out to be an impressive quantity of barley, corn feed, and baled alfalfa, working alongside Belle and a wiry older man named Hector Vega, who ran the farm supply side of the operation, and who regarded Roy with the calm, unimpressed assessment of a man who had seen many people come and go and reserved his opinions until he had sufficient data. Roy worked without complaint and without showing off. He stacked the bales with the systematic efficiency of someone who had done physical labor in his life, which he had, and he followed Belle's directions about where things went without question or argument, which he could see she appreciated. At noon, Belle produced a simple lunch of bread and cheese and cold beans from the small back room that served as a combination office and kitchen, and the three of them sat on crates and ate it. And Hector talked about the quality of this season's alfalfa crop and his concerns about a weevil infestation in the corn supplies coming up from the south. And Belle listened and asked precise questions. And Roy ate his bread and watched the two of them and thought that he had not sat this comfortably with people he did not know well in longer than he could clearly remember. "What is your trade, Mr. Wallace?" Hector asked him over his coffee. The question was asked simply, with no secondary meaning. Roy looked at the weathered lines of the old man's face and at Belle, who was looking at him with genuine curiosity. "I am a finder," he said, which was the closest to the truth that he could get without saying the whole of it. "A finder," Belle repeated. "You find things, people mostly," he said. She thought about this. "Like a detective, something like that. Who do you work for?" "Usually Wells Fargo or the railroads," he said. "Sometimes private parties, sometimes territorial marshals." This was all true, and none of it was the most significant part of the truth, and he was aware of the line he was walking. But the conversation had moved past the most dangerous moment, and Belle nodded with the satisfied expression of someone who had received a complete answer to her question. "That must take you all over the territory," she said. "All over several territories," he agreed. She refilled his coffee cup without being asked, which he noted as a detail of pure instinctive hospitality, and they talked about the territories and the changes in them over the past decade. And Belle had opinions about this too, articulate ones, informed by newspapers and by the direct testimony of people who had come through her store from various corners of the West. And Roy found himself doing something he rarely did in conversation with new people, which was actually saying what he thought rather than the minimum required to get through it. He had forgotten, somewhere in 9 years of solitary work, what it felt like to simply talk with someone without having an angle to it. He left in the late afternoon, having offered to return the following morning to help move the new stock into the correct positions in the storage room, a task that Belle had mentioned and that he had volunteered for before entirely deciding to do so. She accepted with the practicality of someone who needed the help and was not going to turn it down out of some social convention. And he rode to Mrs. Gallagher's and got his room back and lay on the bed in the early evening looking at the ceiling and having a long, quiet conversation with himself about what exactly he was doing. The conversation was not entirely productive, but it was honest. The next morning he arrived at the feed store at 7 o'clock and found Belle already there, already working, having apparently arrived considerably earlier, because several of the items that needed to be repositioned had already been partially sorted. She looked up and said good morning, and handed him a cup of coffee from the small stove in the back room as though this were a thing that had always happened. And he took it, and they worked through the morning with a companionable efficiency that felt, to Roy, like something rare, the kind of ease that usually only came between people who had known each other for a long time. He did not want to leave. This was a new development in the long, unvaried arithmetic of his life, and he held it at a slight distance and observed it carefully, the way he observed most things he was not sure about. On the fourth day of this second visit, Mayor Charles Fitch came into the feed store for what he told Roy afterwards was the express purpose of taking stock of the situation, which apparently involved standing near the counter and clearing his throat significantly until Belle emerged from the back, and at which point he addressed himself entirely to Roy rather than to her, which was the sort of thing that made Belle's jaw go tight in a very specific way that Roy was already beginning to recognize. "Mr. Wallace," Mayor Fitch said, in the warm, authoritative voice of a man who had learned in Ohio that the right voice could make you sound like you knew what you were talking about even when you did not. "I wondered if I might have a word." "Mayor," Roy said. Mayor Fitch glanced at Belle in the way that suggested he would prefer she not be part of this conversation, and Belle looked back at him with an expression of serene attention that conveyed that she was not going anywhere, and Roy, who had noted both of these things, did not suggest that they move to a more private location. "I am aware of your reputation," the mayor said, lowering his voice somewhat anyway. "We are glad to have a man of your standing in Dusty Creek. The thing of it is we have had some difficulty. A rancher named Harlan Pierce, about 8 miles south of here, has been having his cattle stolen, not in large numbers but regularly, and he has not been able to determine who is responsible. I understand this is the sort of thing you sometimes handle." "It depends on the arrangement," Roy said. "I would be prepared to compensate you for your time," the mayor said. "The town has a fund for matters of this kind. $50 if you can identify who is responsible." $50 was not the kind of money Roy usually worked for, but he looked at Belle, who was pretending to be very interested in her ledger, and he thought about how $50 would justify another week in Dusty Creek with rather more dignity than his current situation, which was essentially that he was doing feed store labor for oats and conversation. "I will look into it," he said. Mayor Fitch seemed very pleased with himself, shook Roy's hand firmly, and left with the self-satisfied air of a man who had accomplished something. Belle put down her pen and looked at Roy with an expression of cool amusement. "The great finder, investigating stolen cattle," she said. "It is work," he said. "It is," she agreed. And then, after a moment, with the directness that he had come to understand was simply who she was, "You seem like a man who is used to considerably more significant work than this, Mr. Wallace." "Sometimes a man needs a rest," he said. Something shifted in her expression, something softer and less certain, as though she were considering whether he had meant more by that than the surface of it said. He held her gaze and let her consider it, and after a moment she picked up her pen again and said nothing more on the subject, and he went about the rest of the morning's work. He spent 2 days riding the range south of town, talking to Harlan Pierce, who was a red-faced, blunt-spoken rancher with a sincere attachment to his cattle, and to Pierce's 2 hands, and to the ranchers on adjacent properties, and to a Mexican family named Delgado who had a small farming operation near the creek and who had, as Roy suspected when he asked them directly, noticed certain things in the past several weeks that they had been disinclined to report to the local authorities, for reasons that were perfectly understandable given the consistent poor treatment they had received from said authorities. Roy listened to the Delgados with the same careful attention he gave to everyone who had information, because information was information regardless of the source, and what he learned pointed him toward a group of 3 young men from across the county border who had developed a pattern of small-scale opportunistic theft, and who had been operating just cleverly enough to avoid the obvious attention of anyone who was not looking for them specifically. He presented his findings to Mayor Fitch, who seemed somewhat put out by the identity of the thieves, 2 of whom he apparently knew, and then to the territorial deputy who covered this district and who received the information with professional gratitude and said he would handle it from there. Roy collected his $50 and went to buy dinner. He found himself, without particularly planning it, at the door of the feed store at closing time on a Thursday evening, and he said to Belle, who was locking up, that he thought she might be willing to eat supper with him at the hotel dining room if she had no prior commitment. And he said it the way he said most things, directly, without decoration, aware that he was less practiced at this than at most things he did, and that she would probably notice. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he could not entirely read, thoughtful and careful and slightly vulnerable in a way that made something tighten in his chest. "Supper," she said. "Yes," he said. "Or I can walk back to Mrs. Gallagher's without my feelings particularly hurt, if you prefer." That made her smile, the quick, genuine one. "I did not say I preferred that," she said, and untied her apron and hung it on the hook inside the door, and they walked to the hotel together in the last of the April evening, with the sun going down behind the mesa in colors that would have seemed excessive if they had been painted. Supper was excellent and lasted 2.5 hours, which neither of them commented on, and Belle told him about her father, a good man, she said, with a generous spirit and a remarkable inability to keep financial records, which was why the store had been in considerable debt when he died, and why she had spent the first 6 months of running it doing nothing but accounts. She had grown up in Dusty Creek and loved it with the unsentimental, practical love of someone who had never romanticized the place, but had decided, consciously and firmly, that it was where she wanted to be. Roy told her things he did not usually tell people about growing up in East Texas, about coming west at 19 with nothing but a horse and a general disinclination toward farming, about the series of accidents and decisions that had led him into the work he did. He did not tell her about the reputation. He told himself he did not tell her because it had not come up naturally, because it would have been awkward to insert, because it was not the most important thing about him anyway. Some of this was true. When he walked her back to the small house behind the feed store where she lived, the night was full of stars and the desert air was cool and sweet, and at her door she turned and looked at him with an expression that was very different from the frank professional regard she gave most things. "I have enjoyed this evening," she said. "So have I," he said, "more than I have enjoyed an evening in a very long time." She looked at him for another moment and then she said, "Good night, Mr. Wallace," and went inside. He walked back to Mrs. Gallagher's in the dark under the enormous territorial sky and told himself a number of true things, and arrived at none of the conclusions he had been trying to arrive at. The next 2 weeks moved with the particular sweetness of things that are happening faster than you intended, but not faster than you want them to. Roy found reasons to stay in Dusty Creek, legitimate ones, mostly, because he was honest enough with himself not to entirely fabricate them. He helped Belle prepare the store for the seasonal change in inventory, a significant undertaking that involved reorganizing half the storage room and building 2 new shelving units, which he did himself from lumber he bought at Chester Willis's hardware store. He rode out twice to help Harlan Pierce with some maintenance work on his southern fence line, which Pierce paid him for in a combination of cash and the sort of warm regard that a practical working man extended to someone he had decided was decent. He had several long conversations with Dr. Prude about medicine and frontier conditions, conversations that were genuinely interesting and that Roy found he had been missing without knowing it, the particular pleasure of talking with someone knowledgeable about things you did not know. But the center of all of it, the thing that organized everything else around itself, was Belle. He walked with her in the evenings sometimes. He sat with her at Friday suppers. He helped her carry things and repair things and move things. And she accepted this help without making it into something more fraught than it was. And she gave him coffee and lunch and the particular pleasure of her company. And they talked about everything, about politics and weather, and the water rights question and books and music, and what a person was supposed to do with a life that kept going in directions they had not planned. There was a specific afternoon, perhaps 3 weeks into this second visit, when Roy was repairing the wobbly rear door of the storage room and Belle was doing inventory, and they were talking about something. He could not have said afterward precisely what, and she laughed at something he said, the full warm laugh she rarely let all the way out in mixed company. And the afternoon light was coming through the high window at a particular angle, and she was standing with her clipboard against her chest, and the expression on her face was, she looked, for just a moment, entirely and unself-consciously happy. Roy set down his tools and looked at her. He did not say anything. He did not do anything. But he understood in that moment, with the clean certainty of something that had been building for long enough that it had gotten past the point of being argued with, that he was in love with her. This was a significant development. He considered it for approximately 3 seconds in the private quiet of his own chest, and then he picked up his tools and went back to the door. Belle, who had noticed him look at her, went back to her inventory with a faint color in her cheeks that she probably thought he had not noticed. He had noticed. What he had not noticed, because he was occupied with other things, was that his period of anonymity in Dusty Creek was running thin. It had been, in retrospect, inevitable. Dusty Creek had 200 people and no secrets, and Roy Wallace had been there for nearly 4 weeks, which was a very long time for a man of his notoriety to be anywhere without the information spreading outward and coming back around. The particular shape of the problem arrived on a Saturday morning in the form of a traveling newspaper correspondent named Archibald Kane, who was on his way from Santa Fe to El Paso writing a series of articles for a territorial newspaper about the lives of various notable figures of the American West, and who walked into the Silver Spur Saloon and sat down, and within 20 minutes learned from Dale Hutchins that Roy Wallace had been resident in Dusty Creek for the past month. Archibald Kane was a narrow, eager man with a notebook that he kept in his front coat pocket, and a particular habit of widening his eyes when he was about to say something he considered significant. He caught Roy coming out of the hardware store that afternoon and introduced himself and began asking questions before Roy had entirely decided how to handle the situation. Roy answered the questions in the flat, controlled way he had gotten used to. Yes, he was Roy Wallace. Yes, he had done the work attributed to him. No, he did not think of himself as a legend. Yes, it was dangerous work, and no, he did not particularly wish to discuss the specifics. Archibald Kane wrote all of this down with the speed and fervor of a man taking dictation from a very important person, and Roy was aware, through the entire conversation, that they were standing on Main Street and that anyone walking past could hear all of this. He was aware of it specifically because, at the far end of Main Street, he could see the door of the feed store. He ended the conversation as smoothly as he could, sent Archibald Kane on his way toward the Silver Spur with the promise of a longer interview that evening, which he had absolutely no intention of showing up for, and went back to his room at Mrs. Gallagher's and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about what was going to happen next. What was going to happen next was that Belle was going to find out. There was no way to prevent it at this point. The only question was how she found out. He should have told her himself. He had known for weeks that he should have told her himself. He had not, and the reasons for that had seemed sufficient at the time. She was treating him like a person rather than a figure, and it had felt extraordinarily good to be treated like a person, and he had not wanted to lose it. But those reasons, examined now in the afternoon light of a room in a boarding house in Dusty Creek, did not hold up particularly well against what was actually true, which was that he had let her go on not knowing because not knowing made her comfortable with him, and her comfort with him had become something he was not willing to risk. That was not, he understood, who he wanted to be with her. He went to the feed store. Belle was at the counter. The store was empty of other customers. She looked up when he came in and said, "You look like a man with something on his mind." "I do," he said. He came to the counter and stood across from her. She put down her pen and waited with the patient attention she gave to things that mattered. "There is a newspaper correspondent in town," he said. "He spoke to me this afternoon on the street. His article will probably be published before the end of the month." "About what?" she asked. He took a breath. "About me, about my work." He paused. "My work is not entirely what I told you. I mean, what I told you was true. I do work for Wells Fargo and the railroads and territorial marshals. I find people who have done things they should not have done and I bring them back. But the scale of it is, I am fairly well known. In the territories. The newspapers have written about me a good deal." Belle was watching him. Her expression had not changed substantially, but her stillness had a different quality to it now, the stillness of someone processing. "How well known?" she asked carefully. He told her. He told her about the reputation, about the cases that had gotten the most attention, about the number of men he had brought in over 9 years, about the way people reacted when they heard his name in most towns he came to. He told her about the Dusty Creek night he had arrived and how everyone had stopped and stared, and he told her about how she had not looked up from her mule. When he finished, there was a long silence. Outside, someone rode past on the street. The afternoon light moved on the counter between them. "Everyone in this town knew who you were," she said slowly, "from the first day." "Yes. And you did not tell me." "No, why not?" It was not an accusatory question. It was a genuine one. "Because you looked at me like I was just a person," he said, "and I had forgotten what that felt like." She looked at him for a long time. Her expression moved through several things he could not entirely name, and he stood there and did not try to manage it or smooth it over because she deserved to have this moment be whatever it was going to be. "I am not angry at you," she said finally. "I think I ought to check with myself about whether I should be angry, but what I actually feel is, I feel as though I have been having one conversation and you have been having a slightly different one." "That is fair," he said. "It is also," she said more quietly, "a very human thing to want to be seen as just a person." He did not say anything. The afternoon was very still around them. "Roy Wallace," she said, as though testing how it sounded. "I have been feeding oats to Roy Wallace and asking him to move my salt blocks." "You have," he agreed. Something shifted in her face, not amusement exactly, but the thing that lived adjacent to it and was braver. "Well," she said. "At least the oats were good." He felt the tension in his chest ease in a long, slow release that he had not been entirely conscious of holding. "Belle," he said. "Give me a few days," she said. "Not because I am angry, but because I want to think. This is," she gestured vaguely, "a lot to rearrange in one's head." "Yes," he said. He left. He went to Mrs. Gallagher's and sat on the porch in the evening and watched the sky go through its colors and thought about what he wanted and about what was possible and about the long arithmetic of his life to date, which had been, he understood very clearly now, missing something essential. He did not avoid the newspaper correspondent. He gave the interview the following evening, a short, controlled one, and Archibald Kane went south to El Paso with his notebooks. The few days Belle had asked for were 3 days, during which she went about her work and Roy went about his adjusted version of daily Dusty Creek life, and they saw each other once in passing and exchanged simple greetings with the careful ease of people trying not to make something more complicated than it needed to be. On the evening of the 3rd day, he was sitting on the porch of Mrs. Gallagher's with a cup of coffee when Belle walked up the front path in her blue dress, and she sat in the other chair without being invited in the way you sit in the chair of a place that has become familiar to you, and she said, "I have thought." "What did you conclude?" he asked. "That you are still the same person I have been talking to for a month," she said, "and that the reason it was so easy to talk to you is because you were genuinely here. You were not performing your reputation or hiding behind it, you were just here, working in my storeroom and eating lunch on a crate." She paused. "I also thought about the fact that you told me. You did not let me find out from someone else." "I almost let you find out from someone else," he said honestly. "I came to tell you because I understood I was about to." She considered him. "That is still a form of honesty," she said. "I want you to know that whatever you think about the rest of it, the conversations were real," he said. "Everything I told you was true." "I know," she said simply. "I am rather good at knowing when I am being lied to. I have been running a business for 2 years." Then in a different tone, quieter and more deliberate, "Roy, what are you doing here, in Dusty Creek, really?" He set down his coffee cup. This question deserved to be answered without anything between him and the full truth of it. "I came to find Cutter Briggs," he said. "I found him. I went back for a reason I did not entirely understand, and I told myself I was resting and looking into stolen cattle, and both of those things are true, but neither of them is the reason." He looked at her. "You are the reason." She held his gaze. The evening was very quiet around them. "I have not done this well before," he said. "Being in one place, caring about whether I am seen as a person by anyone in particular. I do not have a great deal of practice." He paused. "But I know what I feel." "What do you feel?" she asked softly. "I feel like I have been riding alone for 9 years, and you are the first place I have arrived that felt like somewhere I would be willing to stop." That sat between them in the warm May evening. Belle looked at her hands in her lap and then at him, and her expression was the one he had seen on that afternoon in the storeroom, entirely and unself-consciously open. "I have feelings about you that I have been pretending are something more practical," she said. "I told myself it was just liking. That I was just glad of the help." She smiled slightly. "I am terrible at self-deception. I think I knew from the afternoon with the salt blocks." He reached across the space between the chairs and she put her hand in his, and they sat on Mrs. Gallagher's porch in the early summer evening and watched the stars come out. And it was simple and it was enormous, and it was both of these things at once. May became June, and June was everything that spring in southern New Mexico territory could be: the high clear days and the sudden thunderstorms and the desert flowers that appeared with startling brightness after rain. Roy had stopped pretending to himself that he was passing through. He wrote letters to the Wells Fargo office in Albuquerque and to the 2 bondsmen who had standing requests for his services, telling them he would be unavailable for the immediate present, and he spent his time in Dusty Creek with the particular presence of a man who has made a decision and is no longer being pulled in 2 directions. Belle received this development with characteristic practicality. She did not ask him what his plans were or try to make them more defined than they currently were, because she was too intelligent to press something fragile, but she also did not pretend that what was happening between them was more casual than it was. She let him into her life in the incremental, honest way of someone who had been managing her own life successfully and was not inclined to hand it over to anyone, but was prepared to share the best parts of it with someone who had proven they could be trusted with them. He met the full population of people who mattered in her daily life. He had several long conversations with Hector Vega, who was as close to a father figure as Belle had at this point in her life, and who regarded Roy with the slow, assessing patience of a man who was not going to be rushed into an opinion about anyone who mattered to his employer. By the end of the 3rd such conversation, which was ostensibly about grain storage and was actually about Roy's intentions and character, Hector's expression had settled into a quiet approval that he did not state in words, because he was not the kind of man who stated things in words when a nod would do. He met the Flores family, who were Belle's nearest neighbors and closest friends, a family of 5 who had been in New Mexico territory for 3 generations, and who extended Roy the frank, guarded welcome of people who had learned not to offer trust too easily but who, when they offered it, meant it entirely. He played checkers with their eldest son, a 16-year-old named Marco, and lost with enough good grace that Marco decided he was all right. He walked with Belle in the evenings and talked about everything, and the everything was different now, deeper and more particular. The kind of conversation that is possible once two people have understood their fundamental intentions with each other and no longer need to be careful about the shape of things. She told him about the grief of her father's death, which was still present in her, though she did not wear it on the outside, and about the particular loneliness of the 2 years in which she had been entirely occupied with work and survival, and had had no time or space for anything more personal than Friday suppers. He told her about the loneliness of constant motion, the way that 9 years of moving had taught him to be entirely self-sufficient and left him with no one who knew him well enough to miss him properly. "I would miss you properly," she said one evening in the tone of someone stating a fact. "I know," he said. "That is one of the things I think about." "What else do you think about?" she asked. "Whether I can be what you need me to be," he said honestly. "I have spent 9 years being very good at leaving. I'm not sure I know how to stay." She was quiet for a moment. They were walking along the creek east of town where the cottonwoods were green and the water was low from the dry month. "Roy," she said, "do you want to stay?" "More than I have wanted anything in a long time," he said. "Then stay," she said, "and we will work out the rest of it." He stopped walking. She had gone a few steps ahead and turned back to look at him. "It is not that simple," he said. "I know it is not that simple," she said patiently. "I am not a simple person and neither are you, and the situation is not simple. I am saying that the wanting is enough to start with, and the rest is work, and I know how to work." He looked at her standing there in the late afternoon light with the creek and the cottonwoods behind her and the particular calm confidence that was so entirely hers, and he thought that he had ridden into this town looking for a thief and had found instead the thing he had not known he was looking for. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed, and they walked back to town together. In July, Roy had a conversation with himself that was long overdue, which was about the practical shape of staying. Belle had a business in Dusty Creek that was the foundation of her life, and it was a good business, and she was not going to leave it, nor should she. Roy had a career that had been, to date, entirely mobile. It required going where the work was, and the work was rarely in the same place twice. He could not do his exact work from Dusty Creek and be the kind of person he wanted to be for Belle simultaneously. Something had to change, and it was going to be him. This did not trouble him the way he had expected it to. He had been Roy Wallace, the bounty hunter, for 9 years, and it had been good work, meaningful work, and he was proud of having done it well. But it was not who he was, it was what he had done, and there was a difference. He was 31 years old and he had $300 from Cutter Briggs and the 50 from Mayor Fitch's cattle situation, and a reasonable amount of savings from 9 years of work during which he had had very few expenses, and he was not without options. What he was, actually, was a man who was very good at finding people and reading situations and navigating difficult terrain, both literal and figurative, and who had developed over a decade a deep knowledge of the territories, and who was good with horses and with physical work and with numbers, and who had spent the past 2 months learning a great deal about the feed and supply business. He had a conversation with Mayor Fitch, and then a longer conversation with the Territorial Land Office in Mesilla, and then a conversation with a rancher named John Aldridge who had a property 3 miles east of Dusty Creek that he was looking to sell and move back east to be near his aging parents. In August, Roy Wallace bought 15 acres and a modest ranch house 3 miles east of Dusty Creek, with a good well and a barn that needed some work and a south pasture that had fine grass, and he told Belle about it over supper at the hotel on a Friday evening. She sat across from him and listened to all of it: the land purchase, the plan he had developed for a small horse breeding operation that he could run while also consulting, locally and occasionally, for the territorial marshal's office on matters that did not require him to be absent for more than a few days at a time. And when he had finished laying it all out, she was quiet for a moment. "You are building a life here," she said. "I am trying to," he said. "I would like to know whether that is something you want." She looked at him steadily. "Roy, I have been in love with you since the afternoon of the salt blocks, possibly earlier. Of course it is something I want." He exhaled a long, quiet breath that released something he had been carrying since the moment he had first understood what he felt. "I would like to ask you something," he said. "Then ask me," she said. "Belle Langston," he said, "will you marry me?" The hotel dining room was not entirely empty, and the people at the adjacent table had almost certainly heard him, and he did not care in the least. He looked at her across the white cloth and the lamp, and she looked back at him, and she was smiling in a way he had never seen before, not the quick, bright social smile and not the warmer, private smile he knew better, but something larger and less contained, as though she had been keeping it back for a while and had just decided to stop. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He reached across the table and took her hand, and the people at the adjacent table began to applaud softly, which made Belle laugh, and it was an excellent evening. They were married in September of 1882, in the small white church at the north end of Dusty Creek's Main Street, on a Saturday morning when the sky was the particular deep blue of a New Mexico September, and the air smelled of sage and late summer dust. It was not a large wedding. Belle had invited the people she knew and loved, which turned out to be most of Dusty Creek, and Roy had the more modest list that 9 years of mobility had left him, but also the warm satisfaction of knowing that every person who mattered to him was in that church. Dr. Prout was there, beaming. Hector Vega was there, wearing his good coat and an expression of serene satisfaction. The Flores family came in their best clothes, and Marco had polished his boots. Mrs. Gallagher wept comprehensively. Pete Dawson, who had been present at every crucial moment of this story since the beginning, sat in the second row and allowed himself a smile of considerable private satisfaction. Tommy Reyes had decorated the church with wildflowers, somewhat informally but with great enthusiasm. Belle came down the aisle in a dress of deep cream-colored wool that she had made herself, or rather had made with considerable assistance from Mrs. Flores and several other women who had descended on her house 3 weeks before the wedding with fabric and opinions, and whom she had managed with the same organized firmness she brought to everything. Her dark hair was pinned up with small flowers in it, and she was absolutely and entirely beautiful, and Roy stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him and thought, not for the last time and not remotely articulately, that he was the most fortunate man in the New Mexico territory. They said their words in the plain, sincere language of people who meant them without decoration, and the minister pronounced them married, and Belle kissed him in front of the whole town with the same directness she brought to everything, which pleased Roy enormously, and they went out into the September morning as Mr. and Mrs. Roy Wallace. The reception was in the churchyard, which was bordered by cottonwoods turning golden, and someone, Tommy Reyes, probably, had strung colored paper lanterns in the branches that would look wonderful when they were lit at dusk, and there was food from every household in the community in the generous, practical abundance of frontier hospitality, and Mrs. Gallagher had made a wedding cake of genuine professional quality that she presented with so much emotion that it was difficult to tell whether the gesture was about the cake or about Roy and Belle, and she never really clarified. Hector Vega, who had been the closest thing to a parental presence at this event, made a toast that was brief and precise and more moving than anything elaborate might have been. He said that Belle's father would have been glad of Roy, and that Roy was a lucky man who clearly understood that he was lucky, and that he wished them a long life and good work. Roy shook his hand afterward with real feeling, and Hector patted him once firmly on the shoulder in the manner of a man who has made up his mind about someone and intends to leave it at that. They spent the first weeks of their marriage settling into the ranch house, which needed more work than the outside had suggested but was fundamentally sound, as Roy had correctly assessed. There was something deeply satisfying about the work of making the place livable, the practical physical business of repairing and cleaning and organizing, done together, in the new space of their shared life. Belle had strong opinions about domestic arrangements and expressed them with her characteristic directness, and Roy had no particular strong opinions about most of the things she had opinions about, and so there were remarkably few conflicts, and the ones they had were the kind that were resolved within 20 minutes, because both of them disliked unresolved things and were willing to be wrong when they were wrong. Belle continued to run Langston Feed and Supply, riding to town each morning on a good bay mare she had named Consequence, which Roy thought was an excellent name for a horse. He worked on the ranch, building the horse operation from its beginning 2 mares to start, both good bloodlines, purchased from a reputable operation near Socorro, and made 2 consulting trips for the territorial marshal's office in the first 3 months of their marriage, both brief and both concluded without significant incident, and he came home from each of them to the lit windows of the ranch house and the particular feeling, already deep in his chest, of arriving somewhere that was genuinely his. In the first winter of their marriage, in November, they had a long conversation about the past, about who he had been for 9 years and who she had been for 2, and about what they were building now, and about the territories and the way things were changing, and about the injustices that were moving through the West like a slow current beneath the surface of ordinary life. The dispossession of land from Mexican families whose claim to it predated the American territorial government by generations, the particular hardships of the Mescalero Apache, whose reservation life was marked by poverty and broken promises, and a kind of grinding institutional cruelty that both Roy and Belle understood clearly from the evidence they could see with their own eyes. Belle had been quietly working with a church organization in Mesilla that provided material support to families displaced by these policies, and Roy, who had been in enough parts of the territory to understand the full picture of what was happening, supported this without reservation and added what money and occasional practical help he could. These conversations were some of the truest ones they had, because the West they lived in was beautiful and brutal in equal measure, and loving it clearly meant seeing both of those things at the same time. The first Christmas at the ranch was modest, and warm Hector came for Christmas dinner and ate 3 pieces of Mrs. Wallace's pie, which he described as excellent in exactly the same tone he used to describe a good crop yield, which Belle received as the high praise it was. Roy gave Belle a small gold locket he had made in Mesilla, and she gave him a rifle he had mentioned once in passing, which surprised him enough that he stared at it for a long moment and then looked at her, and she said, "I pay attention," and that was that. In the spring of 1883, Belle told Roy that they were going to have a child. It was an evening in March, and she told him at the kitchen table after supper, with the same directness she brought to all important information, and Roy put down his coffee cup and looked at her and felt something he did not have an entirely adequate word for, a large, quiet, settled joy, like a door opening onto a landscape wider than anything he had seen before. "Are you happy about it?" he asked, because he wanted to know how she felt before he let himself be entirely overcome by how he felt. "Yes," she said, very, and then in a softer voice, "Are you?" "Belle," he said, "I am so happy I do not know what to do with it." She smiled and reached across the table and took his hand, and they sat in the lamplit kitchen of the ranch house 3 miles east of Dusty Creek, while the March wind moved around the eaves, and Roy thought that this was, without qualification, the best moment of his life. The pregnancy proceeded well, as Dr. Prout reported at each of his monthly visits with the particular combination of medical precision and personal fondness that he brought to all his interactions with Belle, who remained in excellent health and continued to ride to town and run her business through the first 6 months, with the determined practicality of someone who did not plan to stop working simply because a significant biological event was in progress. Roy, for his part, underwent the quiet transformation of a man who had never before had anything quite so permanent to care about, which expressed itself mostly in a sustained, heightened attentiveness to every aspect of Belle's comfort and safety that she found both touching and occasionally excessive. And she told him so, and he tried to calibrate it, and he did not entirely succeed, and she accepted this with good humor. The baby was born in October of 1883, on a cool, clear autumn night, with Dr. Prout in attendance and Mrs. Flores providing the additional practical support that Dr. Prout was sensible enough to welcome. Roy waited in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that went cold, and then got up and paced, and then sat down again, and heard his son come into the world in the way that all births announce themselves, and stood up so quickly he knocked over the chair. Dr. Prout came to the kitchen door with a red, wrinkled, vigorously protesting infant in his arms and said, "Mr. Wallace, you have a son." And Roy took the baby with hands that were not entirely steady and held him, and looked at the small, furious face, and felt the full weight and wonder of it. They named him Thomas James Wallace Thomas for Tommy Ray's, who had decorated their wedding church and whom Roy had grown genuinely fond of, and James for Belle's father. He was a loud, strong, healthy baby who made his opinions felt from his first day, which everyone who knew Belle found entirely predictable. Roy sat in the kitchen that first night with the baby asleep against his chest and the lamp turned low, listening to the quiet of the ranch, and thought about every choice that had led him here, every road and every border town and every case, and the mule called Aristotle, and the salt blocks, and the morning he had stopped walking and almost said something. All of it had led, with the apparent logic of things that were always going to happen, to this room and this night, and this warm weight against his chest. In the morning, Belle sat up in the bedroom with Thomas in her arms and the October sunlight on the white quilt and a cup of tea Roy had brought her, and she looked at both her son and her husband with the particular expression of someone whose life has become, very fully and without remaining gaps, the life they had been working toward. Dusty Creek continued to be what it had always been, a decent, lively, imperfect small community in the beautiful, difficult country of the New Mexico Territory. Roy's small horse operation grew steadily. By the spring of 1884, he had 6 horses and a reputation for breeding stock of reliable quality, and he had reduced his consulting work for the marshal's office to occasional matters only, because his life had reoriented entirely around the ranch and the family and the town that was now genuinely his. Hector Vega retired from the feed store in the spring of 1884 with a generous arrangement that Belle had insisted upon, including a small monthly payment that Hector had resisted, and then accepted with the dignified gratitude of a man who understood that some things were offered with love and deserved to be received that way. He spent his days in a small house at the edge of town and came to supper at the ranch every Sunday, and spoiled Thomas Wallace comprehensively with the indulgence of a man who had earned the right to spoil someone's child. Belle hired 2 new people for the store, a young woman named Clara Ashton, 18 years old and sharp as a tack with numbers, who had come out from St. Louis the previous year with her family and had been looking for work, and a young Mexican man named Esteban Delgado, who was the eldest son of the family Roy had talked to during the cattle investigation 2 years before, and who turned out to be an excellent worker with a natural talent for the logistics of inventory management. Belle was proud of both of them in the direct, practical way she was proud of things she had built well. There was an afternoon in the summer of 1884 that Roy thought about often afterward. He was working in the south pasture, checking the fence line, when he heard the sound of a horse coming along the road, and he looked up to see Belle coming home from town earlier than usual, sitting straight in the saddle on consequence, and she had Thomas in front of her. The boy was almost 10 months old now and tremendously interested in horses, and she was talking to him as she rode, probably explaining something with the particular detailed honesty she brought to all her explanations. And Thomas was listening with the concentrated attention of a baby who was absorbing the full wonder of the world, and they were both backlit by the late afternoon sun, and it was such a complete and perfect picture that Roy stood still for a full minute just receiving it. Belle saw him standing there and raised a hand, and Consequence moved into a canter and they came across the pasture toward him, and Roy thought, watching them come, that he had ridden 11 years on a long road to get here, and that every step of it had been the right one. Belle pulled up and Roy took Thomas from her arms while she dismounted, and the baby made the high, bright sound that was apparently his opinion of being handed to his father, which was a sound of considerable enthusiasm. And Belle straightened her hat and looked at Roy with that expression he knew better than anything. "Chester Willis finally fixed the board," she said. Roy looked at her. "Which board?" "The one outside the store," she said. "The one I tripped on the day you moved my salt blocks." He laughed. It was a full, genuine laugh, the kind that had been rare for him for a long time before this and was no longer rare at all. "Only 2 years," he said. "Chester works at his own pace," she said serenely, and reached up to take Thomas back, and the baby regarded both his parents with the clear-eyed contentment of a child who has been given the strong and stable world he deserves. They walked back to the house together, Roy leading Consequence, the evening coming on around them in shades of gold and rose, and Thomas fell asleep against Belle's shoulder with the sudden totality that small children manage, and the ranch house windows were warm and lit ahead of them. This was the shape of the life Roy Wallace had chosen, and Belle Wallace had chosen, in the spring of 1882 in Dusty Creek, New Mexico territory, built out of salt blocks and oats and ledger books and Friday suppers, and a mule named Aristotle, and a long evening on a boarding house porch and a marriage in the September sun, and a baby named Thomas who had his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness, which was going to be interesting. It was, both of them had arrived at the conclusion independently and shared it without drama one night over supper enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly what they had needed and exactly what they had found. In the spring of 1885, Belle told Roy at the kitchen table that they were going to have another child. Roy put down his coffee and looked at her and felt the same large, quiet joy, familiar now and no less full for being familiar, and he said, "Thomas is going to be insufferable about this." And Belle laughed and said probably yes, and they were right, he was, and in the way of a nearly 2-year-old, which was very funny and only occasionally exhausting. The second child arrived in November of 1885, a daughter this time, whom they named June Frances Wallace, June for the month that the whole enterprise of their love had properly begun, the month when Belle had sat on a boarding house porch and said she had thought it through, and Frances for Hector Vega's late wife, a woman Belle had loved, and Hector received the news of this honor with the measured, complete emotion of an old man who had not expected to be moved and found that he was. Thomas, presented with his sister, was initially skeptical and then rapidly converted to a position of fierce proprietary affection that caused him to follow her around from the moment she was capable of being followed, guarding her from imagined threats with an attention that everyone found both touching and predictable given whose child he was. Roy's horse operation had, by this point, become genuinely established. He had a reputation in the territory for good horses, and buyers came from as far as Albuquerque and El Paso, and he worked the land with the same careful, methodical competence he had brought to everything else he had ever done, and found it more satisfying than most of it because, when you raised good horses from good bloodlines and put them into good hands, there was a clean and traceable worth to it that the other work had not always had. He never took another bounty hunting case. There was a period in the first year at the ranch when the old reflex had stirred news of a particular man in the papers, a request from the Wells Fargo office that had known his work for years, and he had sat with those stirrings and been honest about them, which was that they were the habit of a self that he had genuinely moved past, and he had declined all such requests with a simple firmness that required no apology. Belle knew all of this. They talked about it because they talked about most things that mattered. She had told him once that she thought his old work had done real good in a territory that had badly needed it, and that she was glad he had done it, and that she was also glad he was here, and both things were entirely true, and there was no contradiction in them. He had received this exactly as it was intended. The thing about Dusty Creek, the thing Roy had come to understand about small, permanent communities that he had never understood before because he had never stayed long enough to learn it, was that they were built of threads. Every thread was a connection, a history, a person who knew your name and your business and had an opinion about you, and who you in turn knew and had opinions about, and the whole net of it was what made a place a home rather than a location. He had been a man without threads for 9 years, and the process of growing them had been slow and sometimes uncomfortable, because threads meant that people knew you had failed sometimes and been wrong sometimes and had arrived imperfectly, and a man who was accustomed to riding on before any of that became too clear had to learn to stay still and let himself be known. He had learned it, and it had been the most valuable education of his adult life. Pete Dawson, who was now 70 years old and still sitting on the porch of the hardware store across from Langston Feed and Supply with the serene authority of a man who considered himself the town's institutional memory, had told Roy one afternoon that he was the most reformed human being he had personally witnessed in 50 years of watching people. And Roy had said that reformed implied a starting position worse than he would like to claim. And Pete had said that the starting position was a man who had been alone for 9 years and could not admit what he wanted. And Roy had accepted this characterization with good humor because it was more or less accurate. He and Belle had a quiet celebration in the early spring of 1886, which was the 4th anniversary of Roy's first arrival in Dusty Creek. They did not make a large occasion of it. They ate a good supper at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, with a bottle of wine that Roy had gotten from the hotel dining room, and they talked about the 4 years in the easy, unhurried way of people who have the rest of their lives to keep talking and are not in any particular hurry. Belle said that the best decision she had ever made, looking back, was not looking up from Aristotle when Pete Dawson called her name that afternoon. Roy said that he thought the best decision he had ever made was stopping on his way back across the store and asking where she wanted the crate. Belle considered this. That was not even a decision, she said. That was just a man who had good manners. Sometimes that is all it takes, he said. She raised her glass and he raised his, and they looked at each other across the table in their kitchen in their house on their land. 3 miles east of the town they had made their home, and the children were asleep, and the night was full of stars, and the life they had was the life they had built with careful hands out of everything that had led them to each other. To Dusty Creek, Belle said. To Dusty Creek, Roy agreed. And to Aristotle and the salt blocks, and to the mended board outside the feed store, and to the newspaper correspondent who had arrived just late enough, and to the Friday suppers and the boarding house porch and the September church and all of the ordinary moments that had, one after another, accumulated into something so far from ordinary that Roy still sometimes paused in the middle of a working day to observe it with quiet, steady wonder. He was Roy Wallace. He was known all over the territories, as it turned out, though the stories about him in the papers were gradually being replaced by stories about younger men in newer situations, because history moved on even in the West, and he was glad of it. He was known in Dusty Creek as a man who kept his word and raised good horses and built excellent shelving and could be relied upon to show up when something needed doing, which was the kind of being known that mattered. He was known to his wife as Roy, the full, particular Roy who had arrived with a horse and a gray hat and a complicated history, and had stayed, which was the kind of being known that changed everything. And his children knew him as their father, which was the kind of being known that a man could spend a whole life trying to deserve. Summer came to Dusty Creek with its tremendous heat, and its afternoon thunderstorms and its smell of wet sage and its long gold evenings. And Roy Wallace worked his land and raised his horses and loved his family and walked Main Street on Saturday mornings with Thomas on his shoulders and Belle at his side, and June in Belle's arms regarding the world with the large, thoughtful eyes she had gotten from somewhere that had both her parents claiming the other one as the source. The feed store continued to thrive. Belle had expanded it in the second year, a second building behind the main one for expanded storage, and a small office where Clara Ashton now handled the accounts with a precision that Belle had spent 2 years teaching her, and that she had exceeded within 6 months of learning, which Belle considered an excellent outcome, and which she said so directly to Clara, who was 20 years old now and had become not just an employee but a friend. Esteban Delgado had become the operational backbone of the supply side of the business, and his younger brother had come on to help with the loading work. And the Delgado family's connection to Langston Feed and Supply was the kind of thing that would outlast everyone currently present, which was as it should be. A business built on reliable relationships with good people made itself permanent. Roy had a conversation with his 9-year-old self sometimes, in the way that people do the East Texas boy who had looked west and known, with the bone-deep certainty of the young, that his life was out there somewhere in the wide, difficult, beautiful country. He had been right. It had just taken him a while to understand what out there actually meant. It did not mean being always in motion. It meant finding the place that required everything you had and then giving it. He had found it in Dusty Creek, New Mexico territory, on an April afternoon in 1882, because a woman who was too busy arguing with a mule to look up at the street had declined to be impressed by his reputation, and had looked at him instead as though he were simply a person. He had been a person all along. She had just been the first one in a long time to see it clearly. And he had looked at her direct-eyed, certain, immovably herself in the middle of her practical, demanding entirely hers life, and known, though he had not admitted it for weeks, that he had found the thing he had been looking for. Not the open road, not the next case or the next territory or the next name in the papers. Something smaller and larger than all of those things simultaneously. Home, and the person who made it one. He went in at supper time, because the light was going and the horses were settled, and Thomas would be running to the door any moment, and Belle would be at the stove with June on her hip, and the kitchen would smell of something good, and the whole evening would proceed with the beautiful, irreplaceable ordinariness of a life that was entirely and completely his. He went in.